What if you woke up one day and found yourself standing face to face with a giant? Not a storybook giant or a figure from fantasy, but a real, towering being, one so massive and intimidating that even your heart would race with fear. Imagine the ground trembling beneath your feet as you try to comprehend the size and strength of this creature. Would you run for your life, or would you stand your ground? This is not just a wild imagination, it's a question rooted deep in the ancient stories of the Bible, where giants, known as the Anakim, once ruled the land. These giants were so terrifying that even the bravest warriors of Israel felt small and weak beside them. The 12 spies sent by Moses to explore the land of Canaan returned with a report that sent shockwaves through the entire nation. They said the people there were giants and compared themselves to grasshoppers in their presence. That fear was real and almost stopped the Israelites from claiming the land God had promised them. The Anakim Giants are among the most mysterious and awe-inspiring figures in biblical history. Far from simple legends, they were very real obstacles for the Israelites. Giants who held cities, who inspired fear, and who represented a challenge that tested the faith of a whole nation. The Bible tells us that these giants were descendants of Anak, a powerful giant whose name became synonymous with strength and terror. These beings were not just tall, they were warriors, rulers, and a living reminder of the dangers lurking in the land promised to God's people. Their presence was more than physical. It was spiritual and emotional, creating tension and uncertainty. For those 12 spies, standing before these giants meant confronting the very limits of human courage. But the story of the Anakim is not just about ancient battles and towering figures. It connects with something we all face today. Each of us has giants in our lives: fear, doubt, pain, and challenges that seem larger than we can handle. The Anakim remind us that these giants are nothing new, and the struggle against them is part of the human journey. The Israelites' fear, hesitation, and ultimate choice to trust or give in speak directly to our own moments of crisis. When we see the Anakim through their story, we find encouragement to face our own giants with strength and faith. Their tale invites us to ask ourselves, when giants come into your life, will you be frozen in fear or find the courage to fight? If you want to explore this story more deeply and uncover the secrets behind these giants, subscribe to the Bible Says channel. We dive into biblical mysteries and truths that challenge and inspire. If you find value here, please consider sending a super thanks to support the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that matter. And don't forget, the complete 88 Books Bible is linked below in the description, a powerful resource for anyone who wants to understand Scripture more fully. Now, I want to hear from you. If you suddenly faced a giant in today's world, how would you react? Would you stand your ground or run away? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your answer might inspire someone else to face their own giants with courage. Described in the Bible as the descendants of the Nephilim, a mysterious and powerful race associated with the Watchers, angels who left their heavenly realm and mixed with human women, the Anakim giants were not merely fantastical creatures or exaggerated figures from ancient folklore. This lineage has a profound and eerie meaning, because it represents a breach of divine boundaries and the creation of creatures that were significantly larger and stronger than typical men. In the early chapters of Genesis, the Nephilim are first mentioned when it is stated that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. Giants, famous men and creatures whose existence on Earth was both feared and misinterpreted, emerged from these unions. As part of this heritage, the Anakim continued the terrifying traits that made their forebears so powerful. The term Anakim itself is derived from the Anak name, which means long-necked or neck-stretched, suggesting their unusual size. The Anakim are named after Anak, who comes across as a fascinating and terrifying figure. In the land of Canaan, he was more than just a huge man. He was a representation of strength and fear. Even though the Bible doesn't provide a detailed biography of Anak, his mere presence was enough to shock those who came into contact with his descendants. Imagine being an Israelite in those days, traveling through places populated by tall men whose voices carried authority derived from generations of strength and whose footsteps shook the ground. These giants caused such a great deal of fear that the 12 spies who had scouted the area returned with a report of disbelief and dread. They talked about the Anakim as though they were gods among men, beings so big and strong that the spies were nothing compared to them. However, Anak and his offspring were more than just terrifying characters. A family and a race battling to survive in a seemingly hostile world were hidden behind the myths and the terror. These giants were not solitary entities. They inhabited cities, controlled territory, and upheld societies that flourished in the midst of the common people's shadows. This humanization of Anak and his family encourages us to see past their outward appearance and think about their role in the ancient world's history. How did Anak's descendants cope with the knowledge that they were hunted and feared? Regarding the Israelites and the God they met through the expanding nation, how did they view themselves? These inquiries give the biblical story a depth that is sometimes missed, serving as a reminder that even giants have struggles, survivals, and identities. Biblical texts provide hints that aid in placing the Anakim's story within a theological and historical framework. For instance, the Book of Numbers describes how the Anakim were discovered by spies sent to investigate the area, who spoke of them with both amazement and fear. The stark contrast in size and strength is encapsulated in the statement, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." In addition, Deuteronomy reminds the Israelites of the promise they were given, that the land was theirs by divine right, regardless of the giants and their terrifying reputation. The Old Testament accounts of Joshua's campaigns show the real conflicts in which these giants were opposed and vanquished, signifying important victories for Israel. These allusions are more than merely historical anecdotes. They bear the weight of bravery, faith, and the realization of a divine plan that turned fear into triumph. The fear that the Anakim evoked was not just physical, it was also spiritual and psychological. The Israelites had to face not only a physical foe, but also their own inner doubt and fear when they faced these giants. The Anakim represented the challenges that appeared insurmountable, the uncertainties that threatened to sabotage a people selected for a holy mission. Stories that have been passed down through the generations carry this emotional burden, serving as a reminder that giants, real or imagined, try people's faith and resolve. The Anakim thus act as a mirror to our own difficulties, symbolizing the anxieties that enlarge within us until they seem insurmountable. Recognizing the Anakim's identity also entails understanding how they fit into the greater biblical story of obedience and rebellion, faith and fear, and good and evil. They connect their existence to a cosmic conflict that transcends human history by being connected to the tale of the Watchers and the fall of angels. The Anakim represent the conflict between the sacred and the profane, bearing the weight of human corruption and divine disobedience. Their narrative forces readers to consider the enigmas of divine mercy, justice, and the developing redemptive plan. The existence of giants in the Bible serves as a reminder that the spiritual and material worlds are intertwined, and that faith frequently has to face overwhelming forces. The Anakim were not unbeatable despite the terror they evoked. According to the biblical account, God's promise to give his people the land was eventually fulfilled when the Israelites overcame them and drove them out. But their legacy endured, resonating in the hearts of those who followed them with stories of fearsome rulers and enormous warriors. Even though the Anak children are now part of history, their impact was significant and serves as a reminder of the difficulties humanity faces when faced with forces that outweigh everyday existence. Both believers and academics are still moved by their story, which challenges us to see beyond the material and take into account the spiritual lessons ingrained in their existence. The Anakim are a part of the biblical narrative that connects heaven and earth, myth and reality, fear and faith, as they are descended from the Nephilim and associated with the Watchers. Their narrative humanizes the fight against insurmountable odds and unveils a more profound reality about bravery and faith in God. We enter a world where giants lived and faith had to be greater than the tallest of men by learning more about who they were and the terror they evoked. The Anakim Giants' former home was a place of fear and terror, with cities serving as strongholds for these enormous creatures. Hebron and Debir were notable among these cities due to their strategic significance, as well as the Anakim's overwhelming presence. These cities were more than just places to live. They were hubs of authority where the Anakim ruled and where their mythology flourished. In particular, Hebron was referred to as the city of Anak, a name that made people shudder. These cities' ramparts echoed with the footsteps of giants who had ruled the land for generations, and their walls and fortifications were constructed to withstand both divine and human challenges. There was a strong sense of both fear and reverence in these cities. Because of their immense size and power, the Anakim were viewed by the locals as demigods, beings who held both spiritual and physical power. The giants' presence influenced the culture of these strongholds. Customs, ceremonies, and day-to-day existence were all centered on preserving their dominance and influence. The Anakim were probably at the top of a complicated social structure in these cities, with warriors and followers who admired their power surrounding them. The legends of their power and triumphs over foes were transmitted, giving them an air of invincibility. Entering these cities meant that the Israelites were entering enemy territory, where the Anakim's legacy was evident. The land itself appeared to be burdened by the strength of giants who had once ruled the area and the weight of previous conflicts. The Anakim lived in Hebron, according to the spies dispatched to investigate the region, who emphasized the city's fortified structure and the overwhelming size of the population. The Israelites were terrified by this report, and many of them felt unprepared to deal with such strong enemies. The reluctance to move forward was due to a deeper dread rooted in the unknown, the belief that these cities held secrets and dangers beyond the scope of regular warfare, rather than just a fear of direct conflict. It is impossible to overestimate the psychological toll that these strongholds took on the Israelites. With their formidable walls and fabled citizens, each city came to represent the enormous challenges that awaited them. Stories of Anakim warriors, their weapons, and their conflicts quickly proliferated, adding to the populace's mounting skepticism. According to the spies' account, the Israelites would have to contend with enemies unlike any they had ever faced, in a land where giants roamed free. Many experienced a crisis of faith as a result, wondering if the promises given to their ancestors could actually be kept. These cities were the setting for tales of bravery and divine intervention, but they were also places of terror. Under the leadership of Joshua, the Israelites would test their faith and strength against the Anakim at the fortresses of Hebron and Debir. Some of the most dramatic events in biblical history were framed by the conflict between the Israelites' resolve and the imposing presence of these cities. The weight of these strongholds, both materially and spiritually, forced the populace to overcome their fear and seize the promises made to them. The conflict's character was also influenced by the cultural milieu of the Anakim cities. These giants lived in a society that valued might and upheld authority via coercion and force. The world they created was very different from the new Israelite community, which was based on faith and obedience to God. Their society probably valued warriors and rulers who could maintain dominance over others. The Israelites' fear and hesitancy were heightened by this cultural clash because they were not only up against physical giants, but also a worldview that was essentially at odds with their own. The cities themselves represented the difficulties of entering a territory that had already been claimed by strong forces due to their advantageous locations and fortifications. Perched on a hill with sweeping views, Hebron was a natural stronghold that was challenging to capture. Debir was also well known for its power and importance in governing territory and trade routes. By taking advantage of these advantages, the Anakim were able to keep control and make anyone who dared approach fearful. These cities represented the giants' supremacy to the Israelites, who saw them as a test of their determination and faith in divine direction. The biblical story also suggests that the Anakim's authority was waning, despite the terror these strongholds evoked. Joshua and the Israelites' eventual conquest of Hebron and other cities demonstrated that even the strongest giants and their strongholds could be overcome. This transition from fear to triumph was a watershed, showing that courage and faith could triumph over the seemingly insurmountable challenges posed by these cities and their enormous occupants. So the tale of these cities becomes more than just a description of locations and inhabitants. It becomes a lesson in facing fear and believing in a promise bigger than any giant or fortress. One can practically feel the echoes of a time when giants roamed the earth and their might sculpted the terrain when strolling through the remains of these ancient cities today. The walls and stones recite tales of faith, strength, and terror, a reminder that history is shaped by those who dare to confront the powerful, as well as by the powerful themselves. The biblical story is inscribed with the Anakim city's legacy, which bears witness to the struggles and triumphs of a people who learned to resist the might of giants. The 12 spies were unaware of the weight of their words when they returned from their expedition into Canaan. They had personally witnessed the land promised to their ancestors, a land full of vineyards, fertile fields, and tall cities, and had been sent by Moses to gather intelligence. However, the Anakim's presence overshadowed that vision of beauty. 10 out of the 12 spies came back filled with fear rather than optimism. As they recounted what they had witnessed, strong nations, fortified cities, and most terrifying of all, giants, their voices faltered. Their reports' fear ignited panic among the camp's residents, spreading like wildfire. They described large, powerful warriors who were descended from the Anakim and who, by contrast, made them feel like grasshoppers. Their statements were not merely facts, they were laced with fear, and the Israelites' hearts were contaminated by that fear. It was a restless night. Whispering in terror, families huddled around their tents. Fathers tightened their hold on their staffs. Children were held closer by their mothers. The thrill of arriving at the promised land's edge became a nightmare. The populace started muttering, wondering if the trip from Egypt had been worthwhile at all. How could they possibly survive, much less conquer, the land, if it was populated by giants? The Israelites' attitude quickly changed from hope to despair. The self-assurance that had gotten them through the wilderness started to falter. The imagination expanded with each whispered tale about the giants. The enemy was no longer simply large. They were invincible. However, fear did not overcome all of the spies. Joshua and Caleb stood apart. Caleb's voice cut through the despair and rose above the whispers. He boldly declared, "Let us go up immediately and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." The others' terrified reports contrasted sharply with his words, which were full of faith. Later, Joshua reiterated this belief, telling the people that the land would be given to them if the Lord was pleased with them. However, the increasing panic overshadowed their words. The audience wasn't prepared to hear bravery. Something more profound had been accomplished by the giants' vision. It had caused them to doubt not only themselves, but also the God who had guided them this far. This was not just a military problem, it was an emotional and spiritual crisis. Two voices screamed out to the people, one reminding them of God's strength and the other of their own frailty. The giants' presence made them face their true beliefs. Had they left Egypt only to have a more powerful foe crush them? Or did they continue to believe that the giants could be vanquished by the same God who opened the sea? They were fighting an internal battle that was weakening their resolve. Faith had to fight fear moment by moment, not just once. And when doubt feeds fear, fear itself becomes a formidable foe. The people's cries of terror put pressure on Moses' leadership. Some even proposed going back to Egypt and installing a new leader. Returning to slavery seemed like a safer option than advancing into the future. Despite his burden, Moses remained steadfast. On behalf of the people, he begged God, falling on his face in prayer. However, the harm was already done. The spiritual atmosphere was oppressive, and there was a significant emotional cost. These individuals struggled to think that their suffering had a reason, and they were more than just war-averse. Their vision of iron gates and tall, armed men took the place of their memories of miracles. When the congregation threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb, the tension erupted. Not only was faith being put to the test, but it was also being punished. Those who remained firm were the objects of anger, fueled by fear. At the tabernacle, God's presence was revealed just when faith appeared to be in danger of dying out. The glory of the Lord came to confront rather than to console. God said that this generation would not be allowed to enter the promised land because they had witnessed miracles but continued to have doubts. They would fall in the wilderness, but their children would continue on. Although the punishment was severe, it demonstrated the extent of the people's spiritual illness. The giants had exposed what was hidden in their hearts, going beyond simply challenging them. The tension persisted despite this decree. With a renewed sense of urgency and guilt, some of the Israelites attempted to go up and battle the giants without God's guidance the following morning. Moses told them that the Lord would not be with them if they left. Nevertheless, they went, and they lost. They were crushed by the Canaanites and Amalekites who descended from the hills. Without divine strength, their attempt to regain courage failed miserably. It was a sobering lesson. Fear without trust leads to ruin, and boldness without faith is just recklessness. The giants dominated the people's hearts during this time, but they stayed far away and were hardly visible. The first battle was won by the Anakim without a word or a sword raised. Their mere existence sparked enough skepticism to immobilize a country. The weight of their own fear overcame the Israelites, not any weaponry. The land in front of them was still fertile, blessed, and full of promise. However, people's hearts had become too small to understand it. What started out as a trusting journey had become a belief test. The giants had evolved into more than just adversaries in this test. They represented every inner voice that told you can't win. There had never been such a hush in the camp following the abortive battle. There were no songs or festivities, just the silent understanding that faith would be more expensive than they had anticipated and that the journey would take longer. However, the seed of hope for the future persisted even in this silence. Though they had viewed the world through the prism of belief, Joshua and Caleb had witnessed the same giants, cities, and danger. The following generation would be shaped by that difference, and those who refused to be afraid were beyond the giants' power, no matter how strong they were. With a face worn from years of wandering and a voice steady but heavy with the burden of a nation's future, Moses stood before the people. He was holding not only a staff, but also a message, one that was full of caution and hope. They had lost a lot in the wilderness, including time, strength, and frequently even faith. However, the promise remained intact. That assurance was as unwavering as the day God made it. Moses spoke with an unquenchable fire as they stood once more, close to the edge of the land of Canaan, the same land that had once made them shudder in terror. He reminded them of their last time standing here, the decision to go back, the panic that spread like fire in dry grass, and the fear of giants. He remembered the time when 10 spies persuaded thousands to have doubts, when they saw defeat rather than opportunity, when they looked at the Anakim. Moses, however, had a different perspective at the time and continues to do so today. He described those incidents in the book of Deuteronomy to instruct rather than to embarrass them. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be scared. The Lord, your God, who comes before you, will defend you. These were not just inspirational words. They served as a directive, a reminder that the strength of the one leading them, not Israel's, was the focus of this journey. Moses was aware of the burden of uncertainty. Once, uncertain of his voice, his background, and his deservingness, he had been reluctant to speak when summoned by the burning bush. Failure and frustration had stung him. He refused to go into the promised land himself because he had slammed into the rock out of rage. He wasn't merely a leader above the populace. He was one of them, molded by their struggles and scarred by their anxieties. Moses, however, steadfastly upheld God's word in spite of everything. There was now a sense of urgency in his message. It was their time. The promise was still there, even though the giants and the fortified cities remained. Moses purposefully described the land in this way. He referred to it as a good land, a location that has been selected and blessed, and is awaiting the offspring of those who have previously turned away. He did not minimize the difficulty. He recognized the strength of the inhabitants, the walls, and the fighters. But he counterbalanced it with something more powerful. He reminded them that they had already been fed in the wilderness, driven out of Egypt, and defeated Pharaoh's army by God. Why would the God who created the sea fail them now if he hadn't failed them before? Moses also alluded to God's nature. He portrayed him as a father as well as a warrior, one who led his people across the desert and passed ahead of them in fire at night and clouds during the day. These concepts weren't merely theoretical. All those in front of him had those memories etched into their lives. Every miracle and every provision was a component of the framework that Moses was now constructing. He then challenged them to trust based on that foundation, not with platitudes, but with the self-assurance that had been built via hardship. There was a painful reality underlying Moses' encouragement. He was aware that he would not accompany them. He would never be able to enter the land he had so desperately wanted to. That was a sad but honorable reality, because he wasn't asking them to do something for which he hadn't already given everything. It gave his words more weight. He had guided them through drought, plague, war, and rebellion. He had repeatedly endured God's wrath on their behalf. He now dedicated all of his knowledge and affection to preparing them for what was to come in his farewell speeches, for their children, their future, their fate, not for him. As he spoke, the crowd's excitement increased. This was no ordinary desert moment. This marked the start of something bigger. Although the Anakim's shadow persisted, its strength had diminished. Moses portrayed the giants as stepping stones to a higher goal rather than as invincible enemies. He reiterated, "You must not be afraid of them," reminding them that fear had already cost them too much. The land was a duty as well as a gift. They were going in because God had selected them, not because they were superior or stronger. They were supposed to be humbled, brought together, and given the courage they would require by that truth. Moses raised their gazes as he spoke, pointing out the magnificence of their God rather than the size of the giants. He made it plain that they were not alone in the upcoming conflicts. God would surpass them in strength as well as word. He would expel taller and more powerful nations. He would break the seemingly indestructible walls, and the terror that had imprisoned them would be transformed into power. He purposefully used repetition throughout his message. He was aware of how quickly people forget things. Thus, he reiterated, "Have courage, have faith in the Lord, and be strong." Moses was not looking back, even though the weight of the past hung in the air. They were drawn forward by his voice toward purpose and promise. He exhorted them to speak these truths in their homes, bind them to their hands, and teach them to their children, because he understood that the true struggle was in the heart, not just in Canaan. And when the giants arrived, only a heart rooted in God's word could endure. The people were no longer merely nomads by the time Moses had finished speaking. They were warriors getting ready, but they were using truth instead of swords. Yes, there were still giants in the land ahead. They were starting to realize, though, that those giants would not have the last say. Over the Canaanite hills, the winds had changed. The Anakim's rumors were no longer allowed to spread unchecked through the valleys. A larger force had arrived, one that was motivated by promise rather than just sheer numbers. Despite standing in the shadow of Moses' legacy, Joshua, the new leader of Israel, carried out a mandate that throbbed with divine urgency. He was one of only 2 people who had witnessed the giants and still thought they might fall, and he had been there once before, a long time ago. The land that had once appeared so unattainable now shook beneath the march of Israel's tribes after he returned, this time as a commander rather than a spy. Joshua's approach was not one of heedless violence. He walked with a man who knew the importance of each stride. Each city fell like a stone in a river as the campaign got underway, upsetting everything downstream. Although the fall of Jericho had already caused panic throughout the country, the Anakim were particularly aroused by the attacks on Hebron, Debir, and the highland cities. Based on centuries of enormous legacy, these were more than just towns, they were fortresses. They considered Hebron, a city long inhabited by Anak descendants, to be particularly sacred. It was the pinnacle of Anakim pride because of its tall walls, substantial gates, and imposing warriors. After years of witnessing God's hand accomplish the seemingly impossible, Joshua approached Hebron with confidence rather than hesitation. In addition to being a military conflict, the battle that broke out was also a spiritual one. The sound of steel and cries filled the air as the Israelites pressed against the city's defenses. But beneath it all was the silent power of purpose. These warriors were hardened by 40 years of waiting, trained by trials, fed on manna, and reared in the wilderness. Unlike their parents who had fled in terror, they were different. They came to fight and to complete the task that had started so long ago. The Anakim rallied inside Hebron. Thick spears, double-handed swords, and man-sized shields were among the weapons wielded by massive warriors. They had never been challenged before. Their adversaries were vanquished by sheer size, and the land had long yielded to their will. Israel, however, used a different weapon. Hebron's walls broke with every assault, both literally and figuratively. The powerful fell one by one. Battle claimed the lives of Anak's sons, men whose names rang out in tales of terror. The giants that used to make Israel feel insignificant now faced a formidable foe. However, the battle was not at all simple. the tide of war almost swung in certain places. The Anakim retaliated fiercely on the rocky slopes of the highland passes. The Israelites occasionally stumbled, looking up at opponents who appeared to be made of stone. Joshua, however, did not back down even during these close calls with defeat. Reminding his soldiers that they were fighting for covenant, not conquest, he steadied them. True courage was revealed during these tense moments when dust choked the air and death seemed just inches away. It took time to achieve victory. Debir, another city with a strong Anakim connection, fell after Hebron. The massive siege-resistant architecture of Debir's stronghold was perched atop sheer cliffs. The Israelites persisted despite the desperate fighting of the Anakim who were still there. The defenses fell, wall by wall, stone by stone. The Israeli flag lifted over the once invincible city as the sun sank behind the hills. Joshua ran a systematic campaign. He broke the backbone of Anakim power as he swept through the highlands, destroying city after city and stronghold after stronghold. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah and Israel, according to the Bible. It was more than just a military triumph. It was the dismantling of a generation's fear. However, not every Anakim was killed. Some retreated to locations like Ashdod, Gath, and Gaza, disappearing into the remaining fortified cities. Despite their small numbers, these survivors vowed to return and carried a fierce hatred with them. The tension increased. These were not your typical foes who would just give up or disappear. These giants prepared in their retreat, remembering their fallen kin. Israel's victories were overshadowed by this unresolved issue. Although they were no longer in charge, the giants had not finished yet. Joshua understood the significance of what had been achieved. But even in victory, he was cautious. There were dangers everywhere, and the land was vast. Even though a large number of Anakim had been exterminated from the interior of the country, their continued presence in the coastal regions remained a potential hazard. Peace had been brought about by the battles, but it was not definitive. Buried in the remaining fragments of the giant race was the seed of future conflict. The land that had once been ruled by fear now reverberated with a different kind of story as the dust of war started to settle. It was no longer just a place for giants. It was now the home of a people who had faith in something more powerful than fear. Joshua's triumphs were more than just strategic. They were spiritual turning points that demonstrated the promises postponed did not equate to promises rejected. But giants continued to walk somewhere beyond the hills. Even though they were no longer in charge of Hebron, their legacy persisted. Because there were eyes watching, waiting for the day they might rise again, in the quiet corners of cities that had not yet been overrun, and in the silence that followed battle. The silence that followed the final clash of steel was not the silence of ultimate victory, but rather the quiet before another storm. Even though Israel's banners now fluttered over vanquished strongholds like Hebron and Debir. Not all Anakim had been slain in the ferocity of Joshua's all-encompassing campaign. A remnant slipped away in the midst of the chaos of war, in the smoke of shattered cities, and in the shadows of broken walls. Enough, but not many. Those tall sons of the old line, these survivors, did not disappear aimlessly into the wilderness. With recollection and fury, they escaped, recovering in unconquered cities such as Ashdod, Gath, and Gaza. These Philistine strongholds were located farther to the west, along the coastal plains, where the culture and topography differed from those of the highland cities. The Anakim sought safety here amid the stone temples and trade routes. Power was nothing new to the seafaring Philistines, who had their own aspirations. And they saw more than survivors when they gazed upon these enormous warriors, scarred, vindictive, and full of stories about their vanished mountain cities. Weapons were visible allies, gods perhaps. In the shadows, a terrible alliance was forming. Dispossessed but unbeaten, the Anakim brought a bloody past with them, and the Philistines, thirsty for power, allowed them to re-emerge. With its tall towers guarding the sea and its warriors picking up knowledge from the enormous visitors who passed among them, Gaza turned into a pitch-black sanctuary. Perhaps more than any other, Gath would eventually become notorious for the things it protected. Giants not only survived here, but multiplied. Raised according to their father's methods, the Anakim's children prepared for future conflicts. Their stories were assimilated into the culture of Ashdod, which is located further north. They whispered to each other about the giants who had formerly dominated the hill country. Legends were revived and transmitted from one language to another until memory and myth combined to form a perilous entity. Even after the Israelites triumphed in Canaan, rumors of these giants still lingered and caused anxiety. Joshua had followed orders and expelled the Anakim from the hill country, but the Philistines still controlled most of the coastal areas. And what had started out as a remnant was gradually, subtly becoming a revival. Politics and treaties didn't interest the survivors. They recalled their homes' collapse, their walls' collapse, the cries of combat, and most importantly, the names of the people who had killed their brothers. The threat steadily increased over the years, like a smoldering fire under parched leaves. The Israelites established themselves, planted vineyards, constructed altars, and grew their territory. A fragile peace that failed to notice the sharpened blades being forged in Philistine cities appeared to settle. Young giants were brought up in the corridors of Gath with one goal in mind: retribution. They were instructed to curse the name of Joshua and the God who had commanded Israel's armies, to remember Hebron, and to mention the fallen sons of Anak. They produced champions who were taller, stronger, and more disciplined than before. Even more disturbing, though, was the Philistines' subdued haughtiness. They thought they could control and manipulate the giants' power. The Anakim, however, were wild animals. Their patience was the result of generational hatred, and they were the surviving members of a race that was once dominated by fear. They waited for Israel to become complacent, for the memory of the battle to fade, for faith to falter. A name was whispered in Gath's halls of power, a boy born with 6 fingers on each hand, a child whose very existence unnerved veteran fighters. Others came after, each displaying the characteristics of their hideous ancestry. The bloodline had merely altered its battlefield. It had not perished. The few Israelite elders who recalled Joshua's warnings discussed the danger. However, new generations emerged, ones that were accustomed to routine and peace and had not witnessed the fall of the giants. Stories were born out of warnings. Tales turned into bedtime stories. Eventually, bedtime stories became myths, until one day the earth would tremble once more under the weight of a warrior too big for armor and too powerful for the average person to handle. A reminder that the giants were still there. They had just bided their time. The Anakim's threat came from what they stood for, not from their sheer numbers. They served as living evidence that fear could resurface if attention was not maintained. They had become shadows in a story after their escape, rather than adversaries on a battlefield. However, shadows have a way of unexpectedly slipping into the light. Even though the Israelites had conquered the land, their biggest threat had not been eliminated. And that seed was sprouting into something that would eventually require an explanation in places like Gath. The Anakim's survivors never lost sight of their identity. Their memories were marked with loss, and their bones still had the strength of the old. The fire of a vengeance that would last beyond one lifetime blazed in their eyes as they waited patiently in the cities that had taken them in. To them, the war had simply changed, not ended. and they grew more dangerous than ever while they waited. A new generation of Israelites emerged, one that farmed the fields of the Promised Land but knew little of the giants their forefathers had once feared. Long after the dust of Joshua's conflicts had settled and the fires of conquest had subsided. They carried the Ark of the Covenant in processions and referred to Hebron as history. But the Anakim's story dwindled somewhere in the back of their minds. However, something dreadful had grown tall and powerful in the far-off city of Gath, where the Anakim's descendants had sought safety. A warrior by the name of Goliath was one of them. His presence would arouse a fear that Israel had not experienced in many years. Goliath of Gath was not your typical warrior. Standing over 9 feet tall and with skin like weathered bronze, he was the living embodiment of ancient terror. Like iron gates shutting behind you, his armor clanged. A huge coat of scale armor, weighing more than 100 pounds, encircled his chest, and brass helmet gleamed on his head. A spear that appeared to extend from the ground to the sky hung on his back. Its shaft was as thick as a weaver's beam, and its tip was made not only to kill but also to humiliate. He walked with the assurance of someone descended from a lineage that had formerly dominated Canaan's highlands. He took pride in it. One of the last surviving members of the Anakim line, he was a son of the giants and had grown up in Gath, surrounded by stories of revenge. He had heard tales of Hebron, Debir, the destruction of the ancient cities, and the warriors who had once ruled among men like gods. Goliath bore the anger of a vanished race, in addition to the weight of his armor. Every conflict he engaged in was an affirmation that the giants were still present, and that the terror they had once inspired would resurface. The ground shook as he walked. Even seasoned soldiers loosened their hold when he yelled. His ascent took place in the valley of Elah. The armies of Israel were positioned on one side of the valley, led by King Saul, who was a tall man who towered over the rest of his subjects. However, even Saul, who had once been driven by a purpose, now observed in silence. Goliath emerged from the Philistines' ranks and made his challenge day after day. "Select a man and allow him to approach me. We will serve you if he murders me. However, you will serve us if I win." It was a psychological battle rather than merely a challenge. Nobody made a move. Not a single Israelite warrior came forward. Like a slow poison, fear crept in. Goliath won just by being there. He didn't have to engage in combat. Each time he came back, he made fun of both Israel and their God. Each insult seemed to erode what little courage he still had, as his voice echoed like thunder across the valley. This was about identity, not just a fight. One man had paralyzed the people who had once demolished Jericho's walls. Over the course of the 40-day tension, Israel's silence became more weighty than Goliath's armor. The Anakim, the giants, the spies who had seen them and shuddered. The old stories were whispered by soldiers around the fires at night. Some questioned whether this was the same lineage, whether the adversaries they had vanquished were now making a comeback, more determined and powerful. And the fear of the past turned into a fear of the present. Fathers in Israelite households gave their sons an explanation for why their brothers hadn't come back yet. Mothers prayed for a deliverer as they gazed toward the hills. Doubt became louder than faith in the soldiers' hearts. Goliath's shadow was long, both in terms of height and memory. His size made them think of all they had once feared, and his assurance gave them hope that perhaps, just possibly, the giants had never been truly vanquished. In the meantime, Goliath flourished here. He was theatrical, purposeful, and cruelly strategic. He was no untamed brute. He didn't charge into battle furiously. He waited. He allowed his words to cause harm. He desired surrender over slaughter, humiliation over blood. because the Anakim's legacy would be restored in that surrender. To recover the past, he didn't have to take over Hebron. All he had to do was break Israel's spirit, and it came close to working. Saul stayed in his tent, even though he had previously led armies into battle. All the generals averted their eyes from Goliath. One man had left the army that had once carried the ark into battle unable to speak. This was no longer a strength test. It was a belief test. Instead of battle cries, the valley reverberated with the silence of men who had forgotten Joshua's voice, which had once commanded them to be strong and courageous. Goliath was aware of this. He watched their faces every morning as he stepped forward in the early light. He witnessed how his voice broke their will and how his presence dashed their hopes. Still, nobody showed up. The emboldened Philistines chuckled. They were familiar with the Israelite God's legend. Now, however, they saw even the people of God bow down under the shadow of one giant. Nevertheless, the valley was waiting for a reminder as much as a champion. Because Goliath's ascent was about more than just the Anakim's might. It was about what happened when a people lost sight of their fellow travelers. He wasn't the start of a novel. He was an old fear returning. And fear becomes a monster bigger than any man if it is not confronted. Israel had turned the valley of Elah into a mirror, reflecting not only the might of their adversary, but also their own insecurity. And because of what others had chosen not to do, rather than what he had done, Goliath stood by himself in that silence, unbeaten. When he reached the battlefield, he was only a boy, too small to wear armor, too young to wield a sword, and too unnoticed to be taken seriously. David was the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd from Bethlehem who was sent by his father to see how his older brothers were doing. His stage was not supposed to be in the valley of Elah. He didn't come to fight. He came with bread and cheese. But as soon as he heard the voice resonating across the valley, loud, haughty, and full of defiance against the God of Israel, something inside of him stirred. Goliath's voice. David leaned in as the more experienced fighters backed off. Instead of hearing fear, he heard the challenge. He heard dishonor. Something tightened inside of him as he witnessed the Israeli armies trembling. This went beyond a Philistine making fun of a country. This had to do with someone making fun of the living God. David was unable to ignore that. In an attempt to find out why no one had taken up the challenge, he asked around. Though their eyes betrayed their hearts, the soldiers talked of the reward, great riches, the king's daughter, and freedom for his family. They didn't think they could stand a chance against Goliath. Eliab, David's oldest brother, chastised him as well, saying he was too young to comprehend, arrogant, and careless. David, however, had a different heart. He was not motivated by gain. His motivation was awe. He questioned, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should oppose the living God's armies?" Saul heard of his audacity. David soon found himself in front of the king. Still a teenager with shepherd's hands and sunburned skin, Saul shook his head as he looked at him. Saul remarked, "You cannot oppose this Philistine. You're just a boy." David, however, answered with conviction rather than haughtiness. He described encounters with lions and bears, gloomy nights spent watching over sheep, and times when he was on the verge of death but lived because the Lord saved him. He declared, "The Lord who saved me from the lions and bears' paws will save me from this Philistine's clutches." Saul offered his own armor, perhaps in desperation. It was too large, too heavy. After putting it on and taking a few steps, David removed it. He refused to use someone else's strength to fight this battle. He would fight without armor, fearlessly, and with faith. David entered the valley carrying only a staff in one hand and a pouch containing 5 smooth stones. Goliath chuckled as he saw him approaching. With his shield at his side, The powerful warrior loomed over the boy like a mountain. Goliath mockingly asked, "Am I a dog that you attack me with sticks?" He promised to feed David's flesh to the animals and birds after cursing him by his gods. However, David's response was more savage than any weapon. He didn't yell. He didn't brag. From the fire of belief, he spoke. He said, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies, whom you have disobeyed. The Lord will deliver you into my hands today so that everyone on the planet will recognize Israel as a god." Then, David took off running. He didn't wait for Goliath to initiate contact. He ran ahead, retrieved a stone from his pouch, and slung it like a shepherd. The stone flew swiftly as a sign of faith rather than as a weapon of war. It hit Goliath in the eyes, and the giant fell face down, his body shaking the ground and dust rising from the ground like a fallen idol. At first, there was no joy, just quiet. Israel was shocked to see that the monster that had terrified them for 40 days was now dead, not from a sword, but from a single stone. David approached, removed the giant's sword from its sheath, and severed his head. Fear shattered like a broken wall with that last act. The Philistines went into a panic. The Israelites rushed forward. Once a place of embarrassment, the valley was now a field of triumph. More than that, though, it turned into a testimonial. It was David's trust, not his strength. His bravery had not won him the victory. Because he believed, he prevailed. He held that faith could accomplish what armies could not, that promises were more powerful than threats, and that God was bigger than giants. Everything changed on that day. David's name became well known in Israel. He was taken to Saul's court. They sang songs. David has killed his tens of thousands and Saul his thousands. However, David never forgot the actual events that took place in that valley. The blow was not delivered by his hand. Using a shepherd's sling, God's hand served as a reminder to his people that fear is never the last word. And the nation's hearts were etched with a lesson about Goliath, the imposing warrior of Gath. The uncomplicated faith of a boy who refused to be intimidated by what others saw ended a legacy of fear. David failed to spot a giant. He only needed to see a rebellious man opposing the God of Israel to know how the tale would conclude. They were renowned for their loyalty rather than their celebrity. When few others dared, David's powerful men, warriors honed in caves, exiles, and battles, stood by his side. From shepherd to fugitive, from outlaw to king, they had witnessed his transformation, and the ghosts of the past started to reappear as David grew older. Israel's adversaries still remembered Goliath. His fall had been witnessed by other giants in the shadowy reaches of Philistine territory. In an effort to recover what had been lost, they had sharpened their weapons, trained in secret, and tended to their pride. However, they wouldn't confront David by themselves. They would encounter men who shared their fervor and unwavering faith in the deliverer God. One of the giant's descendants, Saph, was struck down by Sibbecai the Hushathite. At the time of the battle, David's army had developed into a force of skilled combatants, not a dispersed collection of tribes, but a kingdom with a common flag. Saph was just as formidable as Goliath, another enormous being bred for battle. But Sibbecai's refusal to fear him caused him to fall, not his physical prowess. Although the battle was intense, the enemy's size was irrelevant. It was the man's heart who opposed him. Sibbecai stood unflinching. Elhanan, the son of Jarioragim, then came across a warrior whose name, Lami, caused rumors to circulate among the populace. Like his brother, he wielded a spear with a shaft as thick as a weaver's beam, and he was also related to Goliath, a character that the Philistines remembered from their oral traditions. It was a destructive weapon, not a defensive one. But without the pomp and circumstance of royal attention or the support of a crowd, Elhanan took on this imposing warrior head-on and defeated him. The steady hand of a man who had learned to put more faith in purpose than power was responsible for erasing another name and silencing another threat. The unidentified giant from Gath, however, who was described as having 24 digits, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, may have been the most unnerving of them all. This detail may seem insignificant until you take into account its ancient symbolism. 6 is symbolic of incompleteness and man's failure to reach divine perfection in biblical thought. Strong and terrifying, but ultimately imperfect and incomplete, this giant bore 6's doubled, a hideous representation of exaggerated humanity. He called out to incite fear, mocking Israel as Goliath had done. However, David's nephew Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, got up to greet him. Now it was personal. The legacy of that boy who threw a stone in the valley of Elah, the house of David, would not keep quiet. Jonathan's triumph was more than just a male victory. It was a declaration. Goliath was not the end of the fight against fear. It persisted in every generation and every conflict where someone decided to have faith triumph over flesh. These giants were more than just physical dangers. They were the remnants of a past that would always haunt Israel. However, each time one of David's men took the field, they demonstrated something more profound: that those who defy fear are granted divine favor rather than those who are tallest or strongest. The Bible mentions these conflicts in passing in verses that may be forgotten, but each name conceals a tale of valor that helped to define a nation's memory. Now that he was king, David didn't have to use a sling to prove himself. The men who had witnessed him confront Goliath and discovered that fear was not insurmountable carried on his legacy. These were believers, not merely fighters. Men who had been refined in their faith, tested in exile, and molded in the wilderness. And there was no need for wonders or signs when the giants arrived. They recalled. They knew that God would repeat what he had done in the past. Every giant that was killed had more than just a name. They had a message. That obedience was stronger than evil's might, no matter how great. That even terrifying threats could fall when people stood on God's promises. These were living, breathing relics of a cursed heritage, not villains from fairy tales. However, Israel recovered more than just land each time one fell. They took back their identities. They moved closer to the path God had always planned for them and farther away from fear. It's easy to imagine the admiration these warriors evoked among their adversaries, as well as among Israel. Once giant-inhabited Philistine cities started to become more subdued. The jeering voices subsided. The giggling ceased. The same Gath that had once reared Goliath now buried his relatives. Men of faith, not overwhelming armies, had driven the race that had once ruled from the heights of Hebron to extinction. The giants remained in David's memory. He saw the next generation rise and continue the fight even in his last days, when his strength failed and he was no longer able to command in combat. Once a boy in a sling, he was now a king with tales of unwavering friends, warriors who had faith, and opponents who appeared invincible but were not. Israel discovered during those last conflicts a lesson that would stick with them for centuries. Giants can take many different forms, but no one is bigger than the God who defends his people. They gradually disappeared through a protracted, acrid decline in power rather than in the flames of a single conflict. Once powerful leaders who dominated cities like Hebron and cast long shadows over the Canaanite hills, the Anakim started to fade from the narrative. Not because their lineage abruptly ended, but rather because history shifted its focus. The fear that once gripped the Israelites' hearts started to fade into memory after Joshua drove them from the central hill country and David's warriors defeated their last champions. The giants were no longer issuing audacious challenges or marching through valleys. They were just gone. Nevertheless, their story persisted in some way. Following those final encounters, the scriptures are silent. For a brief moment, the names of Goliath's relatives flash before disappearing into quiet. The Anakim's demise is not celebrated with elaborate rituals. This is the day the last giant fell, according to no official record. Rather, they disappear as time passes. Some people think that the bloodline was finally severed when the last of Gath's giants were killed. Others, however, muttered that it was concealment rather than extinction. In villages located close to the ancient Philistine lands, tales started to circulate. There were footprints in the dust, too big for any man, according to shepherds. On moonless nights, hunters described seeing eyes observing from the cliffs. There were stories in some parts of Israelite mythology about men who went too far into the wilderness and never came back, only to find their weapons broken or bent, ripped by something with supernatural strength. These were not stories recorded on temple scrolls or boldly proclaimed from pulpits. They lived in the uncomfortable silence created by the wind howling through the rocks and in the nooks and crannies of campfires. The kind of tales that kids challenged one another to retell, but that the elderly silently scowled at. These whispers were not limited to Israel. Giants were warriors of enormous stature, creatures too big to be men, but too human to be gods, according to other ancient cultures. One can trace the outline of enormous figures whose heads touched the stars and whose power seemed otherworldly in Hittite carvings, Egyptian murals, and Babylonian epics. Were these all remnants of the same extinct race, or had the Anakim evoked something more profound, an archetype of fear itself? As time went on, the mystery only deepened. Skeptics questioned the origins of the enormous bones discovered during archaeological digs in desert caves, some of which were too big for normal men. Had the earth provided a window into the past, or were they misidentified from large animals? In Gath and Ashdod, ancient weapons were found, including spears too heavy for the typical soldier and large blades. Without any explanation, museums put them on display as artifacts from a time when giants coexisted with humans. The idea that the Anakim might not have been completely wiped out persisted, even among the descendants of those who once feared them. What prevented giants from resurfacing, after all, if they had once existed? If Goliath was really more than 9 feet tall? If his relatives had 6 fingers and 6 toes? What if the bloodline had just waited, diluted, and quieted down? Every one of them was born abnormally tall, with thick limbs, huge hands, and a brooding silence in their gaze. Scientists referred to it as genetics. Historians called it a coincidence. Many, however, secretly questioned whether it was something more. According to some, the Anakim fled by sea with the remaining Philistine forces after their cities fell, or they moved eastward into the desert regions beyond Edom. The Bible never ends a chapter definitively, and the myth lives on in that ambiguity. There are still places on Earth that are so isolated and unspoiled that it doesn't seem so unbelievable that something ancient could be hiding in the mountains. According to some traditions, the Anakim have changed into something else, such as guardians of forbidden areas, cursed souls who are never allowed to rest, or spirits bound to the earth. Whether literal or symbolic, they continue to be enormous in the collective memory of humanity, not just because of their size, but also because of what they stood for: dominance, overwhelming fear, and a period when humanity had to contend with forces that were too powerful to comprehend. They were once considered invincible by the Israelites. They claimed that the walls of their cities reached the sky. Even the most courageous men hesitated at their size. Ironically, though, their tale also becomes one of hope, because each time an Anakim fell, it served as a reminder to Israel that their God's promises were greater than any enemy, no matter how big. And maybe that's why their tale still has resonance today. Not because we still see giants in the real world, but rather because we still have to deal with fears that seem equally as tall, powers, uncertainties, and circumstances that could destroy us. The Anakim's legacy extends beyond the remains of Gath and Hebron. It manifests in the way people struggle with faith and fear. It resides in the tales we tell, the shadows we cautiously observe, and the bravery we muster when something compels us to flee. Their disappearance was not a conclusion. It signaled a change from body and blood to narrative and symbol. We think the giants are gone. However, their footsteps left traces that haven't been completely erased by rain. They continue to stand as reminders etched into stone, passed down through the ages, and carried by warriors who have fought against them and survived to tell the story. Perhaps that's sufficient for now. Perhaps it's no longer necessary to see giants to feel them. Perhaps their quiet is more eerie than their roar ever was. Pages have always been absent, chapters ripped from history, unread words, and voices silenced on purpose rather than by accident. Books that described giants in greater detail than most people dared to imagine were among the old scrolls that were once freely distributed among scribes and early believers. Texts regarded as dangerous by some and sacred by others, such as Jubilees, Jasher, and Enoch, teeter on the brink of official canon. The giants, like the Anakim, were not merely a footnote in early scripture, but were key players in a deeper, more enigmatic conflict between heaven and earth. These writings, which are frequently referred to as apocryphal, dared to look behind the curtain of Genesis and reveal what the official story only alluded to. An account that reads like a lost history can be found in the Book of Enoch, which has been preserved in fragments and reverberates through Ethiopian traditions. It talks about watchers, angels who came to earth and betrayed their sacred trust by marrying people. The Nephilim, powerful and fearsome giants who wreaked havoc and blood on the planet, were born of their union. They were more than just tall men. Their very existence was a corruption of divine order, and they were born of rebellion. Furthermore, even though Enoch does not specifically mention the Anakim, their emergence timeline aligns with the ancient world the book depicts, one in which giants proliferated, constructed cities, ruled over humans, and ultimately sparked divine wrath. More vivid stories can be found in the book of Jasher, another ancient text that is mentioned twice in the Bible itself, once in Joshua and again in 2 Samuel. According to Jasher, wickedness was not only spiritual but also scientific, a perversion of nature itself, and the sons of men in pre-flood times learned to mix animals and creatures. Giants are not uncommon in Jasher. They are interwoven throughout its pages, coexisting with people, controlling them, and ultimately being pursued by patriarchs such as Abraham and Moses. According to some academics, Moses was facing the surviving members of these ancient hybrids, men whose bloodlines defied explanation, when he battled the kings of Bashan and Og, not just territorial rulers. More information is added in the Book of Jubilees, which is sometimes referred to as Little Genesis. It explains things that are left unclear in the major biblical texts and speaks in meticulous chronology, giving events precise years. According to Jubilees, the sons of the Watchers were malevolent spirits that persisted on earth following the deluge, influencing humanity and reverberating through the generations. The implication is clear even though the Anakim are not specifically mentioned. Water alone did not wipe out these giants, their descendants, and their influence. Certain lineages continued to exist, either buried in places like Philistia or concealed from view. In addition to being tall men, the giants that Joshua and David faced were remnants of the first uprising. But why weren't these books included in most Bibles if they contain so many answers to comprehending giants like the Anakim? Why did the ancient councils choose to keep others in place while excluding them? Scholars and seekers alike continued to debate that question. Some contend that the canon needed to be clear, that is, theologically consistent, succinct, and focused. Some say it was fear that these books exposed too much, depicted too wild a picture, or introduced concepts that were too hard to control. What does it mean for faith, after all, if giants once roamed the earth, if angels can fall, or if ancient creatures were created as a result of celestial disobedience? These texts weren't always deleted. In Ethiopia, Enoch lived. Medieval copies and rabbinic allusions helped Jasher survive. As though someone knew they would be needed again in the future, jubilees were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls and buried in caves. And now that these texts are once again becoming more widely available, readers everywhere are starting to pose new queries. When Israel saw the Anakim, what did they actually face? Which creatures comprised the giants of Ashdod and Gath? Were they just people, or were they something else? There are clues in the canonical texts. Giants were present on earth during those times as well as later, according to Genesis 6:4. The spy's statement, "We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes," is recorded in Numbers 13:33. According to Deuteronomy, King Og of Bashan, a Rephaim relict, had an iron bed that was more than 13 feet long. These men were not like the others. Furthermore, it appears that the apocryphal texts elaborate on what the official ones only hint at. Reading these overlooked books is like piecing together a puzzle for many people. The Israelites' fear suddenly makes more sense. Later books have more eerie silence. Goliath and his family are now a part of a much darker, longer-running tale, rather than a singular anomaly. The Anakim were not just enormous in stature, they were also enormous in legacy, having been born out of long-forgotten sins and concealed by generations who might have believed that the world wasn't yet ready to remember. Those who seek the truth today have to choose how far they want to go. The foundation and indisputable truth of a God who acts throughout history are provided by the Bible as it currently exists. However, these ancient writings also allude to a more profound conflict that transcends nations and peoples and touches on the domains of earthly corruption and heavenly betrayal. In that area, the Anakim transcend beyond being Israel's adversaries to become the tangible representation of a long-standing uprising and the living evidence that some truths, despite being concealed, never really die. Rumors of bones too big for regular men, of skulls with strange proportions, and of burial sites that defy everything modern history teaches linger among the deserts, beneath the layers of forgotten soil and concealed in the shadow of ancient ruins. These mysteries persist from the North American grasslands to the Middle Eastern valleys. They appear in yellowed newspaper clippings, dusty photos, and stories that are subtly transmitted among tribal elders. Some people write them off as folklore. Others assert that they are evidence of something long forgotten, that giants, such as the biblical Anakim, once roamed the earth. Reports of giant skeletons discovered in the United States started to surface surprisingly frequently in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bones from dig sites in the Ohio Valley, Tennessee, and the Nevada deserts were found to be those of people who were at least 8 or even 9 feet tall, if the measurements were correct. Massive skulls with double rows of teeth, long femurs, and burial mounds filled with artifacts too big for modern humans are described in a number of old newspaper articles. These stories frequently referenced organizations such as the Smithsonian, sometimes as the keepers of the remains and, more controversially, as the ones who allegedly caused the bones to disappear. Time did not kill these tales. Rather, they changed and became ingrained in the thoughts of people who were interested enough to challenge official history. Both amateur and professional archaeologists have attempted to track down the trail, with some claiming that the suppression of evidence is a part of a much larger pattern, and others coming up empty-handed. Did local folklore and eager reporters simply exaggerate these discoveries? Or were genuine findings covertly buried beneath scholarly denial? The story becomes more complex in the Middle East. For generations, people have told stories about skeletons discovered during the excavation of home foundations near the remains of ancient Canaanite cities, such as Hebron, which is biblically associated with the Anakim. Villagers in Syria and Lebanon have reported finding human remains that dwarfed normal bodies. American soldiers have reported, some informally, some in whispers, that they have come across oddly large human bones in isolated locations in Afghanistan's mountains and caverns. One particularly dramatic story, which has gone viral online but has no hard proof, talks about a fight with a giant in Kandahar. Nevertheless, it stimulates the imagination and defies complete dismissal. The issue lies not in the absence of assertions, but rather in the lack of concrete evidence. Bones deteriorate. Preservation conditions need to be exact. Even when they are found, the chain of custody frequently breaks down, photographs, documents, and artifacts disappear. And then, there's the credibility problem. For good reason, mainstream archaeology has high expectations. However, that same rigor frequently rejects the idea that ancient writings such as the Bible might describe actual events. Giants are viewed by many in academic circles as a metaphor, a literary device that highlights the strength of adversaries. Others, particularly those who examine ancient documents in addition to biblical narratives, believe that the universality of giant stories is too compelling to overlook. Examine the Mayan narratives about the Quinametzin, the giants credited with constructing Mesoamerica's great cities and pyramids. Or the Norse myths about the Jutnar, a race of strong creatures that existed before humanity. Titanic warriors are mentioned in the Mahabharata in India. The Titans were the world's first rulers, according to Greek mythology. These myths are not isolated. Despite coming from different linguistic and oceanic regions, they all describe a time when giant strong creatures coexisted with humans and perished. Is it possible that ancient humans inherited more than myth? Is it possible that the stories of the flood, the giant stories, and the apocalyptic judgments are all based on a common recollection of a time when the supernatural existed on Earth? If the Anakim were indeed descendants of the Nephilim, as the Bible claims, then what is left may not only be beneath our feet, but also in our DNA, our anxieties, and our infatuation with giants that will never leave our collective imagination. Some researchers still contend that contemporary technology might uncover information that was previously unattainable through traditional excavation methods. Beneath jungles, LiDAR scanning is revealing hidden cities. Subterranean structures older than previously believed have been found using ground-penetrating radar. Anomalies in human ancestry that don't quite fit the conventional evolutionary narrative are being discovered by genetic testing. If there had ever been physical proof of giants, might it have been strewn about in these isolated locations, awaiting someone who would examine the ancient tales with interest rather than contempt? Sorting fact from fiction is the difficult part. There is a hoax for every genuine excavation. There are dozens of photos that have been shown to be digitally altered for every one that appears to depict a massive skull. That's what makes the search so challenging and fascinating. It requires patience, discernment, and most importantly, an open mind. Thus, the question remains, what makes the concept of giants so appealing to us? Does something deeper, something ancestral, draw us to these stories? Or is it just a fascination with strength and power? Giants might stand for more than just strength. They might represent the spiritual and physical dangers that humanity once faced. Maybe they are warnings from a time when the world was much stranger than we dare to think, and the boundary between heaven and earth was blurred. The bones might never be found. They might be hidden by people who don't want some truths to be revealed, buried too deep, or destroyed by time. The stories are still there, though. The myths go on. People are still excavating in remote parts of the world, not only into the ground, but also into the mystery itself. The Anakim Giants' tale transcends their physical prowess and size, which once made the ancient Israelites shudder. These imposing figures have evolved over time to symbolize something more profound, a metaphor for the challenges we encounter both internally and externally. Similar to how the Anakim threatened to destroy the young nation of Israel by looming over the lands of Canaan, contemporary giants also loom before us in the form of oppression, pride, and fear. The struggles of the past are remarkably relevant today because of these unseen but potent forces that confront us on a daily basis. The most obvious spiritual giant is probably fear. Returning shaky, the spies who had entered the Anakim's territory described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison to the giants they had witnessed. When we are in doubt or danger, many of us recognize that overwhelming sense of helplessness and smallness. Fear has the power to stifle aspirations and dreams, impair judgment, and keep us apart from potential allies. It may appear insurmountable, like confronting an unbeatable giant. However, the biblical story serves as a reminder that fear does not equate to failure. Rather, it pushes us to have the guts to speak up even when we feel like the smallest person in the room. Another enormous force that dominates the spiritual realm is pride. Today, pride can show up as a refusal to accept our limitations or humble ourselves. Just as the Anakim were perceived as haughty and tyrannical city rulers, it makes us oblivious to our shortcomings and separates us from compassion and community. In addition to their enormous physical size, the giants represent inflated egos and unbridled power that have the potential to oppress others and bring about their downfall. By erecting walls around our hearts like the enormous fortifications of Hebron or Debir, pride prevents us from evolving and changing. The true strength against such giants, however, is faith and humility, as the stories of Joshua and David teach us. The most obvious contemporary analogy to the Anakim's rule is probably oppression. The giants ruled over cities and territories, using strength and terror to subjugate those below them. These days, oppression can take many different forms, such as power abuses, systemic inequality, and social injustice. In the same way that the giants crushed those who opposed them, it crushes spirits. Oppression seems like a giant that cannot be vanquished by human strength alone, whether it takes the form of the oppressed people's silence or the oppressive hand of dishonest rulers. The Bible's triumphs over the Anakim serve as a reminder that freedom and justice demand not only bravery and faith, but also action. One of the lessons we learn from those ancient battles is to resist oppression. Giants serve as a metaphor for internal struggles against temptation and sin. The Anakim represent the parts of our lives that appear insurmountable, the destructive behaviors, the self-doubt, and the bitterness that can harden the heart. Each of us can confront our giants with faith and small but decisive steps, just as David did when he faced Goliath with a sling and stones. Because they battle within, whispering lies that demoralize and alienate, These internal giants are frequently the most challenging. However, tenacity, camaraderie, and the strength of faith can defeat them. These spiritual giants, sin, oppression, pride, and fear, often seem to be intertwined and strengthen one another's grip. As a defensive tactic, pride can encourage oppression, and oppression can exacerbate fear. It takes a spiritual awakening, a shift toward hope and resiliency, and more than just physical strength to break free. Despite having their roots in ancient history, the biblical tales of Anakim serve as mirrors that reflect our own struggles and the ways in which we can overcome them. The idea of persevering in the face of overwhelming odds is among the most potent lessons to be learned from the Anakim story. In addition to vanquishing formidable foes, Joshua's conquest and David's triumph also involved having faith in a force bigger than all challenges. The giants had to be faced. They could not be ignored. In a similar vein, the giants of our day, whether they exist in our systems, communities, or minds, must be acknowledged and bravely addressed. They simply have more room to develop when they flee. Knowing that they are not fighting this battle alone gives many people comfort. Despite having leaders like Moses, Joshua, and David to motivate them, the Israelites felt insignificant and exposed in the face of Anakim. We can still find communities and leaders today that inspire us to take on giants together. Whether via friendship, faith, or inner strength, group power frequently overcomes what seems insurmountable on its own. Giants' symbolic meaning also encourages contemplation of legacy. Because the giants' teachings endure, the Anakim's physical disappearance does not negate their story. We leave a legacy of bravery and hope for the following generation when we conquer our own giants. We show followers that oppression can be fought, pride can be humbled, and fear can be faced. This continuous conflict reminds us that every era has its heroes and giants, bridging the gap between the ancient past and our current existence. The central message of the Anakim story is to rise with courage, faith, and wisdom, rather than to give up in the face of giants. Even though the giants are big, everyone's spirit is strong enough to stand. The Bible promises presence and power to those who fight with heart, but it does not promise an easy path. The message is the same whether the giants are internal conflicts or external forces. No giant is too big for the right kind of strength. It is evident to viewers, as they consider this tale, that the Anakim are more than just extinct giants. Rather, they are a reflection of the giants that each individual comes into contact with. The spiritual and emotional battles of today are reminiscent of the physical battle fought thousands of years ago. However, anyone who is willing to face their giants with faith can succeed, just as Israel did. This is the lasting influence of the Anakim's legacy, a reminder that although giants can take many different forms, none of them are invincible. More than just an old legend of tall warriors and bloody conflicts, the story of the Anakim Giants is a profound tale that resonates with people of all ages and speaks to the core of human struggle and faith. Even though the Anakim themselves are no longer on the scene of history, their legacy endures because it contains timeless lessons that anyone dealing with issues that seem bigger than life can still apply. These giants from the Bible serve as a reminder that we can overcome any challenge with bravery, faith, and tenacity. The central theme of the Anakim story is that everyone encounters giants at some point in their lives. These giants might not always be real or tangible. These can be crippling fears, obstructive doubts, depressing hardships, or seemingly insurmountable situations that try our resolve. Our own journey is reflected in the Israelites' encounter with the Anakim. How fear and uncertainty can make us feel insignificant, but faith can change our perspective and give us the strength to rise. The biblical story also demonstrates that trusting in a higher power is more important for defeating giants than simply using strength or weapons. This fact is highlighted by David's bravery, Joshua's leadership, and Moses' prophecy. The Israelites' faith, not just their swords, was what saved them when they felt overpowered. This shows us that with faith, tenacity, and steadfastness, we can overcome any obstacle no matter how overwhelming it may seem. It challenges each of us to think carefully about where we put our faith when the giants arrive. The value of leadership and community is another important lesson. In their conflicts, the Israelites were not fighting alone. They were led, inspired, and reminded of God's promises by their leaders. This serves as a reminder that nobody should have to face their giants by themselves. In our struggles, support networks, whether they be mentors, family, friends, or religious communities, are essential. When the giants seem insurmountable, support from others keeps courage and hope alive. We are also prompted to consider humility by the Anakim's legacy. Because of their enormous size and strength, the giants may have been conceited and tyrannical, and their tale does contain cautions about pride and power abuse. This forces us to reflect. Do we need to face any giants within ourselves, such as pride or selfishness? By reminding us that true victory comes from alignment with divine will rather than just human might, the Bible's depiction of giants challenges us to strike a balance between strength and humility. The metaphor of giants is still applicable when we consider the modern world. Many people deal with societal obstacles that seem like insurmountable giants, personal struggles, and systemic injustices. However, we learn from the Anakim story that these giants are not unbeatable. They are merely short-term setbacks in a greater narrative of redemption and hope. Modern believers are encouraged to endure, to keep fighting, and to have faith that victory is achievable by the bravery of ancient Israel. The question now shifts to you as you consider this journey. What giants do you personally face? Which worries, uncertainties, or difficulties seem more overwhelming than you can manage? Sharing these tales is a step toward confronting those giants head-on, as well as a means of fostering connections with others. Someone else might be moved to courage by your story. We can support each other in faith and perseverance if we take a moment to share in the comments below the giants you are facing. Before we conclude, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to everyone who has shared in this tale of the Anakim Giants. Your assistance is crucial. If this video resonated with you, please think about becoming a subscriber to Bible Says so you can continue to receive more challenging and inspirational biblical stories. If you would like to support this channel's mission of sharing powerful truths from Scripture, please remember to like the video and send a super thanks. Additionally, the link to the complete Bible, which consists of all 88 books, can be found in the description below. It is an invitation to grow in your faith and learn more about the events that have influenced history and still influence people's lives today. Keep in mind that while giants come and go, faith endures. Remain steadfast, maintain your faith, and bravely confront your giants.